I'd like to say good day to everyone who's joining us for our lectionary Bible study. We use the Revised Common Lectionary, and today our text is the Hebrew Scripture and the Psalm for Transfiguration Sunday, which is the last Sunday in Epiphany. The lectionary is based basically on the seasons of the Christian year, beginning with Advent, followed by Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and then we start again in Advent. And each one of these seasons tells a particular point of view or perspectival story about Jesus. And so I want you to know that the Transfiguration of the Lord is a transition Sunday between Epiphany and Lent. Epiphany talks about the celebration of Jesus Christ's self-disclosure to the world. And so there are many stories about Jesus, and as we see him, we see that he is the Christ. One of the stories is the story of the Magi. Another of the stories is of the baptism of Jesus and so forth. Lent, of course, is the commemoration of Jesus' passion, his suffering, and leads up to his death and resurrection. And resurrection, then we'll start the next cycle, which we call a season, which will be Easter. So we're today, I guess you could say that what we are between mountains. One mountain is the Mount of Transfiguration, which we will talk about in just a moment. And the other mountain is the Mount of Calvary, where Jesus was crucified. So if you want to look at it in a certain sort of geophysical way, you could say that Lent is the season that is lived between the mountains, between Transfiguration and Mount Calvary. So we go to our text here, which is 2 Kings 2, 1 through 12. And you'll notice that there are basically two main parts of this text. I'm not going to go into detail, but I will tell you that the text begins with a three sequence event that are basically the same and will tell us something. It's a way that the Hebrews tell stories. If you remember the call of Samuel, Samuel is in the temple with the priest Eli, and three times the Lord calls to him. And the first time he goes into Eli and said, "Yes, master." And he said, "I did not call you. Go back and go to sleep." The Lord calls Samuel a second time, and he's just a young boy. So he gets up a second time, he goes in, and he tells Eli, "Here I am, master." And he said, "I did not call you. Go back to sleep." And so he goes back in, and the third time the Lord calls him, he comes in, and then he and Samuel and Eli had this conversation, which is trying to help Samuel understand this call that comes from God. And Eli tells him what to say if God calls him again, which of course God does. So in this particular text, we have this scene, and it lasts the first, it lasts the first 5 verses. And what we have, I'll just read you the first sequence, and then the second and third will come. Now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. And eventually they get to Bethel, and then eventually they go to the River Jordan. Same sort of sequence. Elisha, the younger, will not be abandoned by Elijah, even though Elijah commands him to stay in Bethel. And then he will command him to stay in Jericho. And then he will command him to stay in Jordan. And so, in one way, the text reminds us that Elisha is very devoted to his master Elijah. And Elijah, as you will recall, had a run-in with Ahab and Jezebel. He killed all of the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, where they had the sort of showdown of the prophets of Baal versus Elijah all by himself. Then also Elijah was somebody that was a voice for Israel. He was probably the most famous prophet in Israel, and his stature approached that of Moses. As we will see in Mark's gospel later in the week, Elijah and Moses are both on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus, James, and John. They are all together on that mountain. And what this is a kind of a combination of how important Jesus is, and also how significant this moment that they have on what is probably Mount Tabor. So after Elisha basically says, I am not leaving you, I am staying with you, then you can see there's this sort of emotive, emotional moment where the prophet Elijah is going to be taken up to heaven by Yahweh, and it's a translation. He doesn't die; he just is taken up into heaven by a whirlwind. And so this is important in the text, that Elisha does not want him to go, and to ease the pain of this separation, which is going to happen all too soon. What Elijah does is he asks Elisha, is there something that I can do for you? And so instead of assuming Elijah's mantle or asking for some physical object by which to remember the great prophet, what Elisha asks is a double share of his spirit, the spirit that makes him brave, the spirit that makes him speak, I guess you could say talk turkey to kings and other sovereigns without any fear of retribution that may come his way. And so he asks for a double share of his spirit, which means that he wants to be fortified with ruach, or pneuma in the Greek, the Spirit of God, which gives him strength and help. Another interesting fact of this is that Elijah will take his mantle and he swats the River Jordan, and it parts or separates, and the two walk through it on dry ground. And you might say, that sounds very similar to what happens when the Hebrews escaped from the land of Goshen in Egypt to freedom, as they began their trek in the wilderness or in the desert for 40 years. And that is exactly what this text is referring to, is that this new prophet with the old prophet walks into a new situation, And we could say that this is another sort of Exodus story. We will see these things replicated in the Bible as we go through them. And so, this ancient miracle of the Exodus and the people of Israel escaping through the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea on dry ground before the chariots of Egypt get swallowed up by the waters again. It's the same sort of Exodus story. And so, what we need to know is that this story is about a transition in Israel between prophetic leaders of Israel and Judah. The nation has been divided at this point, and so it's all the more important for these prophets to speak the word of the Lord to the people to kind of keep them on the right path. And there's this transition between the older, much esteemed prophet of Elijah and the new prophet, Elisha, who will cut his teeth on the prophetic word of God and share that with the people. The second text that we have for today is the text from Psalms. It's the Psalm 50, 1 through 6. I need to find the right psalm here. And this is a psalm that has to do with those moments of life when things don't seem to go our way. The whole psalm, and it has 12 verses, has to do with thanksgiving for recovery from some sort of serious situation, perhaps even a serious or grave illness. We could even think of it as a recovery from something like COVID. I know that not everyone believes COVID is a real thing, but we've had enough people in this town and in this church that have gotten it that I would say it is a real thing, and we hope and pray that the vaccines that are coming out and that many people are beginning to get will stem the tide of this disease. But for this disease and also for the circumstances of our country right now, we need to be in deep and thoughtful and meditative prayer for those things. So let's look at these first verses of Psalm 50. Psalm 50, I misspoke a moment ago. Psalm 50 has 23 verses, and it talks about an acceptable sacrifice. I don't think this is right. Yes, I do. All right, so it begins by saying, "The mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting." This is a Hebraic way of saying from beginning to end, or from soup to nuts, or from A to Z, from the rising of the sun to its setting. It means a whole period of time. The mighty one, this God of Israel, God the Lord Yahweh, summons the earth all the time. Constantly is what it says. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. And so this talks about the perfection of beauty and about where God comes from. God comes from a place of beauty, of perfection, of something that is peerless and something that cannot be compared with anything else. Our God comes and does not keep silence. In other words, this is a speaking God, and All we have to do is refer back to Genesis 1, where the first chapter of Genesis basically has God creating by the Word. God speaks things into existence. Word in Greek is logos, and so there's a certain divine logos that speaks the Word, and things happen. The dry land is separated from the waters. The animals are created, the animals of the sea, the animals of the land, the animals of the air, which would be birds. God speaks human beings into creation. So our God comes and does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire and a mighty tempest all around him. This is to talk about that wherever God goes, there are manifestations of power, a mighty tempest, which means like a storm. You could think of tornadoes or hurricanes or something like that, or a devouring fire. All one has to do is look at the footage on the news last fall from the fires that were taking place in California, in the mountains and the foothills, and know how it seems like human beings have no power and are impotent in front of this kind of power. That's what the psalmist is describing about God. He calls the heavens above and to the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me my faithful ones who make a covenant with me by sacrifice. And so here is the idea of an acceptable sacrifice for one who may have come through a very difficult time. And then in verse 6 it says, the heavens declare his righteousness. That means Yahweh's righteousness, God's righteousness. For God himself is judge, is the judge. And so it's, even though people, and Jesus says this himself, judge not, lest ye be judged. The real judge of the world and beyond is God's self. And at the end of verse 6, we see this little word called Selah in the text. And it is some kind of a worship instruction, some kind of a singing instruction, some kind of a liturgical instruction for the people. And it tells them what to do next. This is not what it is. It is not stand up or sit down, but it's something like that. We just don't know what Selah means. And at the very beginning of the psalm, it says a psalm of Asaph. And Asaph, of course, is a particular group of priests that may have used this psalm and claimed it as their own. I'd like to thank you for being with us today, and later in the week we will deal with the text from the Gospel of Mark, and we will also deal with one of the Corinthian letters that Paul wrote. So thank you.